The asylum had loomed over the town for decades like a scar no one wanted to acknowledge. Its jagged roofline clawed against the night sky, windows gaping like sockets where eyes had once been but had long since rotted away. The older residents remembered the stories. Doctors who performed treatments that were more torture than cure, patients who were locked away and never spoken of again, screams in the middle of the night that no one dared to answer. Officially, it had been shut down due to structural instability, but the people who lived nearby whispered darker reasons. Nurses found wandering the streets, their minds snapped, patients who vanished without records, shadows that moved in the corridors long after the last staff had left. Jason had grown up hearing those stories around campfires, told by kids who wanted to frighten each other. He laughed them off every time. Ghosts weren't real. Curses weren't real. The only monsters in the world were people. But bravado has a cost, and his friends knew exactly how to push him. On Halloween night, under a cold sky with no moon, they had cornered him near the iron gates of the asylum. Phones were raised, laughter was sharp, and the challenge was simple: spend the night inside. Record it. No excuses. Jason felt something shift in his stomach, a ripple of unease, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he smirked and pushed the gates. They shrieked open like tortured metal, the sound so shrill that his teeth ached. For just a second, he thought he heard something in the echo of that scream, like another voice, faint, buried in the sound. His friend shouted encouragements, some mockery, and Jason gave them a careless wave. The doors loomed ahead, dark and heavy. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, drew a slow breath, and stepped forward into a place where even the air seemed reluctant to linger. The wooden doors resisted his push, as if the building itself did not want to open. But Jason forced his way inside. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, like exhaled breath from something long dead. The beam of his flashlight carved a trembling path across the floor, stirring up layers of dust thick as ash. The entrance hall stretched out like a cathedral to ruin. Peeling wallpaper, cracked tiles that looked like broken teeth, furniture toppled as though someone had left in a panic and never returned. A row of wheelchairs hunched against one wall, rust gnawing through their metal frames. One of them had straps, the leather cracked but still holding the shape of wrists that had once been bound too tightly. The sign above a nurse's desk was still there, though its paint was bubbled and faded. Psychiatric ward, staff only. Jason lingered on it, the beam of his flashlight steady, but his hand trembling. For the briefest moment, the letters seemed to twist, as though trying to spell something else. He blinked, shook his head, and the sign was normal again. Then, without warning, the front doors slammed shut behind him. The crash echoed through the hall like a thunderclap, sending vibrations crawling up his spine. Jason spun, nearly dropping his light, but the doors were closed tight. He tried a handle, it didn't budge. The air seemed to thicken around him, pressing down, filling his ears with a low hum he could not explain. He stood in the silence, every nerve screaming, and that was when he realized the silence wasn't empty. Somewhere deep within the asylum, faint but unmistakable, something was breathing with him. Jason forced himself to keep walking, each step echoing too loudly across the broken tiles. The beam of his flashlight darted nervously from corner to corner. Every shape in the shadows looked like something watching him. The jagged outline of a broken cabinet, the hunched silhouette of a coat rack. He muttered to himself, just to break the silence, but his voice sounded too small, swallowed instantly by the cavernous halls. Then it came, a sharp metallic clatter in the distance. Jason froze, heart thudding against his ribs. It wasn't faint. It wasn't the settling of old pipes. It was deliberate. His light swung toward the far end of the hall, just in time to catch movement. An old wheelchair rolled across the corridor, its rusted wheels squealing against the floor. No one pushed it. Jason's throat went dry. He backed away a step, eyes fixed on the chair as it wobbled to a stop in the middle of the hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, another sound, a squeak. The wheelchair shifted slightly, as if tugged by invisible hands. Jason's breath caught. His rational mind clawed for explanations. Tilted floors, gravity, wind, but none of them made sense. The hallway was still. The air was heavy. The wheelchair trembled once more and then stopped, facing him directly, as if daring him to sit. Jason whispered, "No," but his voice cracked, and he knew the asylum was already unraveling his bravado, thread by thread. Jason forced himself to move past the wheelchair, though every nerve screamed at him to turn and run. The corridor narrowed into a small station where a broken desk sagged under the weight of time. Dusty papers littered the floor like autumn leaves, their edges curled and blackened with mildew. He crouched, lifting one of the folders. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blurred, but he could still make out names. Lydia Harker, Samuel Crane, Rebecca White. Each page was stamped at the bottom with a single word in red: unsuitable. Jason frowned. Unsuitable for what? The reports didn't read like medical notes. They were fragmented, written like diary entries, rambling about voices in the vents, figures seen in mirrors, shadows that climbed into beds at night. These weren't medical diagnoses. They were warnings. As he flipped through another file, a sound pulled him upright. Whispering, soft, layered, like a dozen voices overlapping one another. Jason spun in a circle, flashlight beam cutting across the room. The whispers grew louder, rising from behind the desk itself. He crouched and peered into shadows beneath. The space was empty, except for the air, thick and alive with sound. The whispering stopped the moment his light touched it. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if something had noticed him. And then, very faintly, a single voice slithered from nowhere and everywhere. Jason. The folder slipped from his hand. Jason's footsteps led him deeper into the building, until a rusted sign pointed him toward the children's ward. The moment he entered, a suffocating cold swept over him. His breath misted, his skin prickled, and the air carried the faint, sweet rot of moldy cloth and dust-choked toys. Rows of tiny rusted beds lined the room, their frames bent and their mattresses long since rotted to stains and springs. Along the walls, shelves still held remnants of childhood. A cracked porcelain doll with a missing arm, a stack of blocks fused together by grime, a stuffed bear with its face torn open as if something had clawed at it. Jason's light landed on a single bed at the far end of the ward. On it sat a rabbit plush, upright despite the stuffing spilling from its chest. Its glass eyes reflected his beam too brightly, giving the illusion that they were glowing. Jason's heart thumped painfully. He told himself it was just a toy, but then he swore he saw it move. Just slightly, a tilt of the head, like a child regarding him. The beam of his light trembled. The toy didn't move again, but Jason could not shake the feeling that the whole ward was watching him through those broken, eyeless toys. In the silence, the air carried a faint sound that froze him in place. A giggle, not from his imagination, not from memory. A child's laugh, high and brittle, echoing across the beds. Jason's hand shook so badly the beam shook across the walls. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice sounding too fragile in the frozen air. No answer came, but the rabbit's head now faced him directly. Jason left the children's ward with his pulse hammering in his throat. The corridor beyond stretched endlessly, its walls stained with dark patches of water and time. He moved quickly, the sound of his boots sharp in the silence. But then he heard it, soft at first, almost like the twitch of mice. A scratching. It came from the walls. Faint, dragging, deliberate. Nails, or claws, scraping against plaster. Jason stopped. The sound stopped. He moved again. The scratching followed. Louder now, scraping behind him, beside him, crawling through the hollow veins of the building. He pressed his hand to the wall. The surface was damp, clammy under his touch, and beneath it, something moved, slow, deliberate, dragging itself along the inside of the walls, matching his every step. Jason's flashlight flickered as though the thing inside the wall had pressed close against the wires in the plaster. He stumbled back, his throat tight. The scratching rose into a screeching, a violent tearing. as if whatever was inside wanted out. The plaster bulged outward, faintly cracking. Dust sifted down. Jason bolted down the corridor, the scratching chasing him along the wall, always keeping pace, until he stumbled into a heavy iron door. His hands shook as he forced it open and fell into darkness beyond. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt almost worse. Jason steadied his breathing and raised his flashlight again. The iron door had led him into a vast room with peeling tiles and rusted metal that glistened in the light like old blood. The moment he stepped inside, the smell hit him, sour, metallic, sharp. He gagged, clamping a hand over his mouth. This was a surgery theater. Rows of cracked glass jars lined the shelves, their labels faded beyond recognition. Rusted trays sat waiting, their instruments long since corroded, but still sharp enough to gleam with a hungry edge. A scalpel, blackened with time, lay on a cracked porcelain sink. At the center of the room stood the operating chair. Its leather straps were cracked but still fastened tight to the armrests. The chair's headrest was tilted back as though it had last held someone who had never left. Jason circled it slowly, his light shaking. The silence in the room felt heavier than any place he had been so far. Then, without warning, the overhead lamp above the chair buzzed and flared to life. Jason nearly screamed, his light jerking toward the sudden illumination. Dust swirled in the beam like ash caught in a storm. The chair looked different now. The straps didn't just look ready, they looked used. The floor beneath glistened with a black stain, thick and permanent. Jason backed away, his chest tightening. The buzzing of the lamp grew louder, angrier, as if the light itself resented his presence. And then the sound cut out. The lamp went dark again. Jason stood trembling in the thick silence, knowing he was no longer alone. Jason swallowed hard, forcing himself toward the exit. But before he reached the door, his flashlight swept across the far wall. His stomach dropped. There, clear against the plaster, was a shadow. Not his. It was tall, distorted, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Jason froze, raising the flashlight to check the space in front of the wall. Nothing stood there. The shadow had no source. He swung the light wildly around the room. Empty. The wall remained marked with the figure, and as he watched, it began to twitch. The head tilted farther, bones cracking in his imagination. The arms lengthened down the wall until the fingers scraped the floor. Jason's hand trembled so badly the light jittered, but the shadow moved with perfect clarity. And then, it stepped away from the wall. The shadow peeled itself free of the plaster like a body detaching from skin. It loomed for a moment, featureless and silent, before collapsing back into the wall and vanishing. Jason stumbled backward, choking on his breath, his flashlight beam darting desperately over empty walls. The only sound was his heart, thundering in his ears. Jason fled the surgery room, his feet pounding against the tile as he threw himself into the hall beyond. He didn't know where he was going, only away. His beam caught on a stairwell, descending into darkness. Cold air breathed up from the basement like the exhale of something vast and sleeping. Each step downward moaned beneath his weight, threatening to give way. The deeper he went, the colder it became, until his breath floated in pale clouds before his face. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a clock counting down. The staircase ended in a door of thick iron, its surface corroded and wet with condensation. Jason hesitated. His instinct screamed not to open it, but behind him, the shadows of the hallway stretched unnaturally, as if urging him forward. His trembling hands gripped the handle, slick with damp, and pulled. The door screeched open, spilling him into a corridor that smelled of rust and something fouler, like old blood that had never dried. Somewhere in the blackness of the basement, a door slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot. Jason spun, flashlight darting wildly. He wasn't alone down here. The corridor stretched endlessly into darkness, lined with iron-barred cells that hadn't seen light in decades. Jason's flashlight swept across one after another. Each cell, nothing more than a small box with claw marks etched deep into the walls, as though the people inside had tried to dig their way out with their bare hands. Rusted chains still dangled from the walls, swaying slightly though no draft stirred the air. Jason walked slowly, the silence pressing down, so heavy it felt alive. Every few feet, his beam caught on words scratched into the plaster. "Let me out. I hear them." They watched through the glass. His skin prickled at every message. The further he went, the more desperate the writing became, until the words devolved into jagged slashes and symbols that hurt to look at. Then his light landed on one of the cells at the far end. For a second, his mind refused to believe what his eyes showed him. Between the bars, just for a heartbeat, a face appeared, pale, hollow, its eyes two pits of bottomless black. It pressed forward silently, as if trying to push through the bars. Jason staggered back, his beam jerking. When the light swept back, the cell was empty. Only rust and claw marks remained. But his pulse refused to calm, because he knew what he had seen, and in the echoing silence he swore he heard faint breathing, coming not from his own chest, but from within the locked cells all around him. At the very end of the basement corridor, Jason's flashlight caught on a doorway, hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside was a room unlike any other he had seen in the asylum. Every wall was covered with shattered mirrors, the shards reflecting his light into 1,000 trembling beams. Some pieces leaned against the walls, others were propped on broken tables, and a few were embedded directly into the plaster, their edges sharp and jagged. Jason stepped inside cautiously, the crunch of glass beneath his shoes echoing too loud. He angled his light toward one of the larger shards and froze. His reflection looked back at him, pale and terrified, but it didn't move with him. He turned his head, slowly left. The reflection kept staring straight ahead. Cold fear slid down his spine. He raised his flashlight higher, his reflection still locked in place, and then smiled. Not his smile. Too wide, too sharp. The skin around its mouth cracked as the grin split farther than a human jaw should allow. Jason stumbled backward, his beam scattering across the shards. In every mirror, his reflection was now smiling. Dozens of versions of him, grinning too wide, their teeth jagged, their eyes empty. They leaned forward, pressing against the glass, as though trying to push themselves free. Jason ran from the room, but even outside, every polished surface, every fragment of glass and metal, seemed to shimmer faintly with a smile waiting to crawl through. Jason's frantic steps carried him into another chamber, one that looked less abandoned than the rest. The doorplate, though tarnished, still bore a name: Dr. Elias Mercer. The room was lined with shelves that sagged beneath the weight of dusty books and brown bottles filled with dark, unidentifiable substances. The smell in here was different, chemical, sharp, almost sweet. On the desk lay a journal, its leather cover cracked but intact. Jason brushed away the dust and opened it. The handwriting inside was meticulous, neat, almost obsessive. He read a few lines, his heart tightening with every word. The patients are not sick. They are vessels. Some resist, some shatter, but a precious few, are suitable. Jason flipped to the last entry, his breath shallow. The glass must be fed. It shows us their true faces. Soon, the barrier will break, and they will not need us to open the way. The final page was soaked in a dark stain, the ink blurred into illegible spirals. Jason's hands trembled as he set the book down. His skin prickled with the sense of being watched, though the office was empty. Slowly, he raised his flashlight to the corner. There was a mirror there, small and square. His reflection stared back at him, but something was behind it. A face, pressed close to the glass, smiling over his shoulder. Jason spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. He turned back to the mirror. The face was still there, and now its mouth moved. Jason backed out of the doctor's office, his pulse thundering in his ears. The corridor stretched ahead, darker than before, the air so thick it felt like breathing underwater. As he walked, faint whispers rose from the plaster, the same walls covered in claw marks. At first they were too soft to understand, like someone muttering behind a door. But step by step, the voices grew clearer. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams, dozens of them, all overlapping, men, women, children, crying out in panic, in agony, in despair. The walls shook faintly, dust raining down from the ceiling as if the asylum itself were alive and pulsing with their torment. Jason pressed his hands to his ears, but the screams drilled into his skull, vibrating through bone and marrow. Then, cutting through the chaos, came one single voice. Low, calm, impossibly close. It whispered his name, Jason. His flashlight flickered violently. For a moment, the beam showed outlines moving within the walls, distorted, writhing shapes pressed against the plaster, their mouths open in eternal cries. Fingers clawed outward, stretching the surface, desperate to break free. Jason ran, but no matter how far he went, the screams followed, crawling beneath his skin. He realized with sickening certainty that they weren't just inside the asylum. They were inside him. Jason burst through a heavy metal door and stumbled into a vast, circular room. His beam revealed rows of tiered seats rising into shadow, like an ancient amphitheater. In the center of the floor stood an operating table, its straps torn but still sticky with something dark. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered across trays, their edges catching the faint light. The silence here was suffocating, broken only by the slow drip of water, or blood, into a metal pan. Jason crept closer, every step echoing through the theater. On the table lay a shape covered with a stained sheet. His instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, but his hand betrayed him, trembling as it reached forward. He pulled the sheet back. It wasn't a corpse. It was a mirror, a full-length mirror, strapped down as though it were the patient itself. Jason's reflection stared up at him, wide-eyed and shaking. But behind him, in the reflection, the seats were full. Row after row of pale, grinning figures sat in silence, watching. Their eyes glowed faintly, their mouths stretched in identical smiles. Jason spun around. The theater was empty. He turned back. In the mirror, they were still there, and now, one by one, they were rising from their seats, stepping down toward the table. The glass began to ripple. Jason stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the mirror's surface pulsed like liquid, and something pressed against it from the inside. A pale hand broke through first, dripping with glass shards that melted into the floor. Then another. The reflection of Jason himself crawled out, except it wasn't him. Its eyes were hollow voids, its smile too wide, its movements jerky like a marionette. "Go back," Jason whispered hoarsely, but the doppelganger only tilted its head. From the mirror, more figures began to emerge, each one a distorted version of him. They filled the room silently, their footsteps echoing like the tick of a clock running out of time. Jason bolted for the exit, but the door slammed shut. He pounded on it, screaming, as his flashlight fell and rolled across the floor, its beam landing on the mirror. The reflection within showed something impossible. Jason still standing before the glass, motionless, his face twisted into that wide, unnatural grin. He turned slowly, heart dropping into his stomach. His copies were gone. The theater was empty. Only the mirror remained, and in it, his reflection raised a hand and waved. Then the glass shattered. Darkness swallowed everything. No one saw Jason again. But late at night, if you walk near the asylum, you might catch your own reflection smiling at you from a window you never passed.